Starting's always the hardest part. If you clicked on this video, then I imagine it's because you wanted to learn how to make music with a computer. Now, this video, I'm mostly going to be talking about how to do it using FL Studio, since that's what I use to make music, and the demo of it is freely available. This demo doesn't allow you to save, but almost every single other feature is there. So this is a good option if you don't want to spend money on it yet, to just have some fun in the demo, and you can still export the music you make. So as long as you're able to make the music you want to in a short enough amount of time, you can actually make whatever you want even with just the free demo version. I know that might not mean much coming from someone who is clearly using the full version of FL Studio, but I used the demo version for a very long time. Actually, a very long time. In fact, the music you're listening to now is a bit of an older track I pulled out on purpose. I managed to make this entirely in the demo version of FL Studio. It was a lot of work, I won't lie to you, but just to show you, it is in fact possible. Have a listen. It may have a few mistakes in it that I kind of cringe at now, but overall I'm still proud of having made it, again, especially in the demo version. I guess I should also bring up before I continue that because this is a very beginner-orientated tutorial, I'm going to cover things slowly, but that doesn't mean that you have to spend a long time just to learn a little, because the chances are that a decent amount of you watching will have already learned a decent amount of these things. I just have to say them in case someone hasn't. For that reason, I've taken the care to split this video into chapters. If you don't know what I'm on about, you can now put a series of timestamps in your YouTube videos, and it will actually split the video up into quote-unquote chapters. If you hover over the time bar right now, it should be split into pieces showing where each section starts. If you want to skip straight to those sections, you can either drag your little ball all the way over to them, or you can go into the description and find the corresponding timestamp and click it and it'll take you right there. If there's a section on something that you're pretty confident you already know about, and you're in a little bit of a rush, you can skip ahead to the next section. Although do keep in mind that you might not know everything about that particular section. So if you have the time, I would still recommend rewatching those bits to make sure you've got the basics down. It should be the same for future videos in this format as well. That being said, this video in particular is going to be a very basic start. Essentially all I'm going to do in this video is make a drum beat, make a chord progression, and make a melody. Talk a little bit about basic music theory and how to use the menus in FL Studio. And of course, if you still have any issues, go ahead and ask me in the comments about them. One last thing I really should mention is that, to be fair, there are multiple different things besides FL Studio you could also use. These music making programs are called DAWs, or DAWs, Digital Audio Workstations. And as far as I've seen, out of the different DAWs out there, Ableton and FL Studio are the two big ones. However, you often see a little bit of a condescending attitude from Ableton users to FL Studio users. A lot of arguments will break out over which is the best DAW to use. And I bring this up just because I think it's important for you to know, especially when you're just getting into this, that really, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, just about every even half-competent DAW out there gives you the exact same capabilities as every other DAW. The only thing that changes is the way it looks and the way it lays out its buttons. Ultimately, everything that you can do in Ableton, you can also do in FL Studio. And the same is true the other way around. Everything you can do in FL Studio, you can also do in Ableton. The only way in which what I have said is not true is that the synthesizers and effects that you get with FL Studio will be different from the synthesizers and effects that you get in Ableton. However, it is also possible to put the effects and synthesizers from Ableton into FL Studio, and, of course, put the synths and effects from FL Studio into Ableton if you want. Since ultimately it is the synthesizers and effects that determine how much you can do with a DAW, and the vast majority of DAWs out there allow you to use any synthesizer or effect, the only thing that will change will be the ones that come packaged with it. It always seemed a bit pointless to me to argue over which is the best. So don't be disheartened if someone tells you that FL Studio is not worth using, and equally, if you are not using FL Studio and watching this video, don't get disheartened because I am not using your DAW. It's not a statement that I think that FL Studio is superior. To me, honestly, this whole debate seems a bit pointless, and I really do think they're all equal and you really get down to it. The reason why I ended up on FL Studio in the end is basically what I said. I could use the demo for free, and it didn't restrict me, and I got comfortable with it because it had a nice presentation. Well, with all that said, let's open it up. Alright, so now you want to... Where do I start? I could... Wait, what are you doing? Oh, right, yeah, the step sequencer. That's probably the best place to start, to be honest. So yeah, as it looks like you figured out, you can place down these little blocks on here, and then when it gets to them, it will play that sound. You just left-click to place them. And you've probably already spotted the play button up there. Yeah, there you go. Not a bad start. Alright, now just pause it for a second. Oh no, it looks like you misclicked. Yeah, don't worry, this is a common mistake, but it's very easy to deal with. You accidentally clicked the button to the left of the pause button. This button switches between pattern mode and song mode. When it's in pattern mode, it will play whatever's in the step sequencer. But usually, when you make a track in FL Studio, you make its parts in the step sequencer, and then you put the parts together in the little menu to the left called the playlist, and that's how you make your actual song. So you can also put it on song mode, and it will play whatever's in the playlist. Of course, though, we haven't put anything in the playlist, which is why we can't hear anything right now, even though the music is still playing. This is really easy to fix, though. If you want to go back to pattern mode, just simply click on the pat above song. Or alternatively, you could just place the pattern that we just made into the playlist. To do that, all you have to do is click the playlist. Usually you would also have to pick which pattern you want to place too, but because we've only made one pattern, it will already be on the correct one. There you go. In fact, now you can place as many as you want by just clicking more. To get rid of them, just hover over them with the mouse while holding down right click. Alright then. Now I guess I should probably explain what these little grey squares in the step sequencer are. Well, you've probably already figured out that these are drum sounds, but that's not quite 100% correct. That is what they're playing, but the thing itself is called a sampler. You can place more of these in if you want in the Add tab, but when you open up the default project, it usually has 4 of these already with these 4 drum samples. Samplers are pretty simple. They simply take a sound file that you give them, and they play them. If you click on the grey square, you can open them up. Now I know this is a lot of buttons, but a lot of them aren't very important to us for a while. If you're going to be using samplers, the most important thing to note is this file button here. Here you can change which file they use, and give it any sound file. We'll get to this in a second, but you can also drag anything from the left menu called the browser into the sampler if you don't want to open up the file explorer to find these files. Since you're going to see later, this browser part on the left has quite a few sound files in it already. This browser is full of multiple files that are going to be important to making music. However, probably most important for now are simply the audio files that are already in there. If you look for the packs section, open it up, and then find the drums folder in there, you will find multiple folders full of drum samples. And you can just click and drag them onto these grey rectangles to replace the sound file with the new sound file. Mess around a little bit with it. Not sure if that one works, but you can always replace it with another sound. If you're happy with how that sounds now, then we should move on to the next thing. If we're done with this pattern, then before we start doing any more work, we should probably do it in a different pattern. Otherwise, if we started doing a melody now, it would be impossible to separate the melody from the drums. We need to create a new pattern and put whatever we're going to do next in that. To do this, just look at the top left, and the 4th option along you'll see Patterns. Click on it, and a little drop-down menu should appear. The first 3 options will all create a new pattern. Personally, I prefer to use Find Next Empty, No Naming. If you'd rather be more organised and name all your patterns, you certainly can. If you pick either of the other options, you will have to name your pattern before you can create it. But personally, I struggle a little bit to work that way, just because I don't always know what I'm going to do in the next pattern, and I don't want to have to rename it again if I change my mind, so I prefer to leave them unnamed. If you think you'd get confused though not naming your patterns, then obviously there's nothing wrong with naming all your patterns. Even if you do end up naming it something and then changing your mind about it later, you can always rename it using the 5th option on that menu, Rename and Color, because you can also give patterns a color, which will show up when you place it in the playlist. This is just in case you wanted to color code your project and be very, very organized. Right, I think we should start doing some chords next, but we have a bit of a problem. We can't really make chords with drums, so we're going to have to learn how to put something in besides just more drums or sound effects. Oh, I see you found the instrument section of the pack folder. For the most part, the packs folder is just filled with sound effects, but it does actually have a few instruments in it, obviously in this folder. This isn't the normal way you would add something, but we'll go with this for now. Oh, don't worry about all this. We can get to this later if we need to. As long as you don't touch anything, this sound is already a piano anyway. Alright, let's start making some chords. It's all the same note. Well, clearly this isn't right. It's a little embarrassing, but I made this same mistake, and for a long time this is what discouraged me from really getting into making music with FL Studio, was that I could not figure out how to actually play notes. I thought you had to use the step sequencer, but everything was always the same note when you used it. I did find a little drop-down menu that allowed me to change the notes of things in the step sequencer, but that caused another problem then. You might have noticed that the notes this piano is playing are ringing out for a really long and annoying amount of time. That is because every note that is placed inside the step sequencer is automatically set to infinite length. This is because it's usually used for drums, and if the note was only like 1 beat long, but the drum sample was longer than 1 beat, then the sample would simply cut off before it finished. So while this works well for drums, it means that if you try and use an instrument that actually can hold a note, everything you place will have infinitely long notes that will ring out forever. So even once I had figured out a roundabout way that I could pitch the notes that I was placing in the step sequencer, I still had that problem. And eventually I found out what I was doing wrong. I should have been using the piano roll. To open up the piano roll, just right click on the rectangle that represents the instrument, and top of the menu you'll see piano roll. And it'll bring up this menu. Now this is much more like it. You can see the keys on the left side, and you simply click to place a note in, and you can change its length by dragging at it. Now we're on this menu, I think it's about time we start talking about what these tools at the top do. Almost all these tools are also in the playlist and do the same things there. First, and probably most importantly, we have the pencil tool. The pencil tool simply makes it so that when you click, you place a note, and if you keep holding down click, it will drag the note until you release. Personally, this is what I would stick with most of the time. You do also have the Paintbrush, which works the same as the pencil, only if you click and hold, instead of dragging the note to be able to move it around, you can place multiple notes at once by clicking and dragging. We have Paint in drum sequencer mode. It's the same as the Paintbrush tool, only all the notes you place will be the same short length. I don't really see the use of this, to be honest. Next is delete, just what it sounds like. You click and it deletes notes, but actually I wouldn't recommend using this too often because you can already delete notes in pencil mode just by right clicking. The only difference is by going into delete mode you can do it by left clicking. There's then mute, which is if you want to mute certain notes, simply click on them and they go grey and they won't play. Just click on them again to unmute them. There is slice, which lets you click and then hold down, move your mouse to create a line and then let go to slice. It will cut any notes touching that line into 2 pieces where the line intersects the notes. There is select, which makes it so that when you click and hold, you start drawing a box, and when you let go, everything inside the box becomes selected. There's zoom mode, where you can also draw a box like in select mode, but this time instead of selecting notes, it will zoom the camera in so that you can only see what is in that box. I think it's generally better to just zoom the manual way though. You can zoom in and out horizontally by stretching the little bar at the top, and to do it vertically you have to use this little button at the top right. Click and hold and then drag up or down to zoom in or out vertically. And finally there's Playback, which is one that I don't tend to use often, but to be fair, maybe I should use it a bit more. As you can see, it creates a line wherever you hover your mouse, and when you click and hold, it will play whatever notes are touching the line. And just while we're talking about these tools, almost all of them are also in the playlist, as I mentioned, but there's one in the playlist that isn't in the piano roll, so I'll just quickly explain that one now. You'll see this little button with the 2 arrows. If you click and drag on a pattern or sound file with this, and you cut it down so that not all of the pattern or sound file is in the playlist, you can use this to change which part it uses. For example, if I had a sound file that was 3 seconds long but I was only using a second of it, by using this tool and dragging around, I could change what second out of the 3 seconds it uses. Alright, now we've covered all that, we can now get to making our chords. But, you haven't been using scales so far, have you? I'd really recommend that you start using them now, especially if we're going to do chords. You did a pretty good job, honestly, working without scales with single notes, but now that we're playing multiple notes at once, it's going to get quite difficult to get away with that. Don't worry though, scales are not going to make your life harder, they're going to make your life easier. A musical scale is essentially just where you take a few notes from the options that you have, 12 of them, and say that you're not going to play those notes. You've probably heard of major and minor, with major scales typically sounding happy and minor scales sounding sad. All of these are the kind of conventional scales most people use, and they're all 7 notes. There's a different minor and major scale for every single note, but don't let that confuse you because F minor is the exact same as E minor, just one note up. If you took all the notes of E minor and moved them up one note, you would have F minor. Of course though, I don't expect that you know all the major or minor scales already, so let's find out what they are. Luckily, FL Studio actually makes this quite easy. You see, this little button over here opens up the Stamps drop-down menu. Stamps is their little names for collections of notes. It has both chords and scales in it. Let's select major, and go find out what the major scale for C is. You can see that, conveniently, maybe this is why I picked it, C major is a scale that uses none of the black notes and all of the white notes. So that should make it a little bit easier to remember which notes you're supposed to be using. Just a quick thing I want to clarify as well for people especially new to music. There isn't actually a difference between the white notes and the black notes really. They are just different notes. It's not that the black notes are special in some way. The only difference is, unlike the white notes, which are just denoted as C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, the black notes are denoted like C sharp, or D sharp, or G sharp. If you've heard of flats before as well, that's just a different way of saying the same thing. C sharp is the one above C, D flat would be the one below D. So C sharp and D flat are the same note, it's just a different way of saying it. That's why in FL Studio they all just say sharp. I just wanted to clear that up, because I remember when I was a lot newer to music, I had some kind of idea that the black notes inherently created tension. Like all horror music was using those black notes, and all music that was pretty and harmonious was avoiding using them. I was only under that impression because of course C major is a scale that doesn't use any of the black notes, and so a lot of people like to start with it. And if you use notes outside your scale, it's going to sound tense and inharmonic. But if you have a scale that uses a lot of the black notes, then you can actually make them sound very pleasant just like the white notes. With all that said though, let's go back to our C major scale. How does it sound if we play it? Were you caught off guard by how that sounded? Well, that was C major, but if we just slam all the keys at once like that, it's going to sound a little bit dreadful. That's because these notes don't harmonize well, because there's so many of them and they're so close together. We'll get a little bit more into this later, but essentially, if the ratio of the frequency of one sound to the frequency of another is relatively simple to understand, then our brains interpret it as nice and harmonious sounding. Whereas if the ratio is a lot more complicated, then it sounds tense and uncomfortable. This C and C sharp don't sound very nice together when you play them at the same time, because they're both extremely close to each other in pitch. Meaning the ratio between them is quite complicated. Whereas if we play this C and G note at the same time, it sounds a lot more pleasant. This is because G is exactly 1.5 times the pitch of C. So it is a lot easier for our brains to implicitly understand. So as you can imagine, if we play all 7 notes of a scale, not only are some of them very close together, but as well as that, with there being so many notes, it's very difficult for our brain to understand very quickly. And so it creates a lot of tension. Now this can actually be a good thing depending on the circumstances, but definitely to start out, generally we'd like to make things that sound more harmonious. They're easier to make sound pleasant. Another thing as well is this rule even applies with notes that are technically very far apart, like this C5 and this C sharp 6. This C sharp 6 is over an entire octave higher in pitch than this C5. An octave, by the way, is the distance between the start and end of a piano before it starts repeating notes. So you would think if we played these 2 notes at the same time, it wouldn't sound so bad. And it's definitely not as bad as it was before, but that was still not very pleasant. This is because every single time you go up an octave in pitch, you're actually just doubling the pitch of something. Which is why C5 and C6, even though they're technically different notes, are both labelled C. C6 is exactly the same as C5, it's just doubled. So if C sharp 6 is exactly the same pitch as C sharp 5, just doubled, then it makes sense that it still doesn't sound very pleasant when being played alongside C5. If we want this to sound more pleasant, we're going to have to space our notes a little bit more. And the most obviously perfect note for this is one I already mentioned, G. With major and minor scales, no matter which scale it is you're using, the fifth note in that scale will always be the note that harmonizes the most perfectly with the first note. And that's because, as I mentioned, the fifth note is exactly 1.5 times the pitch as the first one. Alright, well, just before I get into actually making some chords, I just want to point out a couple ways you can help yourself remember which notes you're supposed to be using when you move on to using more complicated scales that use some black notes and some white notes. The most simple way you can go about it is you can simply keep going back to that stamp tool, finding the major/minor scale option, selecting it, and placing it down. But of course that isn't very efficient. You can also add a new instrument that is completely silent, and then add the notes into that instrument, and then switch to the instrument you want to use, and because in the same pattern, you still have those notes placed just on a different instrument, you'll see them sort of see-through in the background, and that can remind you of the correct notes as well. But this method isn't very smart either, because it's very time-consuming. Not only are you adding a new instrument entirely for this, even if it never plays, but because it only applies for that pattern, every single time you make a new pattern in that scale, you'll have to do the same thing again. So clearly this isn't the best way to do it. Personally, I just memorized it, and if I ever forgot, I went and used the stamp tool, but I have found out now about another method, which is probably the best for you to use. When you go into the piano roll, if you go on the piano roll options little arrow here, there should be a bunch of little menus that you can look at. You will either have to look inside your view menu, where there should be a helpers section, or your helpers section might be below the view menu. Either way, go onto the helpers menu, and the second option down should be scale highlighting. From there, you can select your root note, and select what scale you're using, be it major or minor or any of the other options. Once you've done this, all the grayed out sections on the grid will now show the notes that aren't in your scale. For our purposes though, we're already on the correct scale, because it's set to C major by default, since again, C major doesn't have any of the black notes. But if we were to use another scale, this would help us remember which notes we're supposed to use and which ones we aren't. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut myself off there. I did want to continue this video, but it won't be done in time for Christmas if I keep going. I had about 45 minutes worth planned, and at this point, I only had this much done, and I thought it's probably best I cut it off here. As well as that, even though I was prepared to make a 45-minute long video, for a first video, I didn't want to scare anyone off, and while 45 minutes isn't too bad, I would have been alright with anything under an hour, I would have preferred something closer to 20-30 minutes, so I feel alright cutting it off here. It is a bit of a shame because I was just about to teach you how to use chords, but you'll see that in the next part, and also, I've kind of already taught you the basics of how music works, so if you wanted to try and make your own chords without me actually telling you anything about chords, which might plant an idea in your head and might make your music less original, then go ahead. It might be a bit more difficult to produce good chords that way, but it might help you make more unique chords if I don't tell you the kind of basics of chords first, because you'll have a very different idea going in. If you feel like you're struggling with chords though, then I'm afraid you just have to wait until the next video where I'll cover chords, and that shouldn't take too long hopefully. Definitely we'll try and get it uploaded at the very least before February. Anyway, thank you for watching, and Merry Christmas.